Go.
Good afternoon and welcome to our viewers today. My name is Dave Anderson. I'm a senior policy fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, otherwise known as WIPS.
Thanks, Dave. And I'm Eric Giordano, the Executive Director of WIPS, and very glad to be here. Dave, why don't you, before we get started, tell us a little bit about WIPS.
Absolutely. Founded in 2007, the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system with a mission to educate and engage citizens, develop future leaders, and help communities address issues that they care about.
Yeah, you know, Dave, we have another pretty serious topic today, a really intriguing topic with some outstanding guests. So we really want to get right to our program, but I think our viewers would be disappointed if we didn't share just a few important items up front. So first, we'd like to assure everyone that we are still cognizant of our immense planetary-sized heads, which give us extraordinary powers of thought and reasoning. Second, we are really grateful for our token representative of an attractive younger demographic, Luke Rudolph, who, by the way, we pay to be our producer and we pay to be our biggest fan. So thank you very much, Luke. Third, we always enjoy hearing from you, our viewers, and you can share your topic ideas at info@wips.org. If you have questions for our guest today, you can also type them in the chat box if you are live, and we'll field some of those questions. Finally, Dave, you know, last week there were several references to barbershops, and a few episodes ago, I think you even mentioned a particular barbershop that you like to frequent in Madison, and that made me think about my take on barbershops, which is really quite different from yours. As a bald guy, I like to walk into barbershops, and when they ask if they can help, I just say, no thanks, I'm just looking, and then I walk out.
I can totally get that reference, Eric, and I think that's pretty darn funny. But it's funny that you mentioned my barber in Madison. You know, his shop is actually downstairs in one of Madison's major hotels, and I've often told him he really needs to move up to the level above the lobby up on the first floor, so then he could say his place is a cut above the rest.
Right.
So there you go.
Yeah, Luke, we're still waiting on the laugh track, okay? Anyway, all right, Dave, are you ready to introduce our guests?
I am ready to introduce our guests, and I think we should get right to it. You know, our show today, we're going to be discussing the topic of criminal justice reform, which is a huge topic, and we've lined up some real heavy hitters for our guests today. First, we're pleased to welcome Milwaukee County Sheriff Earnell Lucas. Sheriff Lucas was born in Milwaukee's Hillside Terrace housing project, and upon the death of his mother was raised by his grandmother. He attended, I lost my place here. Excuse me for just a second. He attended Milwaukee Public Schools and has a bachelor's degree in criminology and law studies from Marquette University. He was sworn in as Milwaukee County Sheriff in January 2019. Before becoming sheriff, he served as Major League Baseball's chief liaison of security and investigations for the National Association of Professional Baseball League. Prior to that, he spent 25 years in the Milwaukee Police Department. Sheriff, we're glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next, we'd like to welcome the Honorable Reverend Everett Mitchell. Judge Mitchell was elected to the Dane County Circuit Court as a juvenile court judge and presides over cases involving family reunification, juvenile delinquency, and other civil and criminal proceedings. Judge Mitchell oversees Dane County's drug court program and has worked with the Madison Metropolitan School District, the second largest district in the state, to create an Office of Youth Engagement that provides a bridge for youth involved in the criminal justice system to educational programming. Since 2011, Judge Mitchell has also served as a senior pastor of Christ the Solid Rock Baptist Church in Madison, Wisconsin. And welcome to you, Your Honor. And finally, it's our pleasure to introduce John Birdsall of Birdsall Aubert and Associates, LLC. John is a prominent Milwaukee-based defense attorney who focuses exclusively on wrongfully accused clients. In 30 years, John has earned a reputation as one of the most trusted and victorious criminal defense lawyers in the state of Wisconsin. With over 260 jury trials, mostly for serious felonies, and an acquittal rate 3 times the state average. He's a past president of the Wisconsin Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and a member of the State Bar of Wisconsin Board of Governors, which oversees the entirety of Wisconsin's legal system. Welcome to you, John.
Thank you.
Okay, you know, I'm going to be really straight up here. If you took away the two bald white guys and just took a snapshot of our three guests, I think this would be one of the most impressive and talented group of professionals in the state of Wisconsin. You know, each of you, what was interesting to me, not knowing you personally before we really started this, was how compelling your stories are in terms of your background, your experience, your expertise that got you to where you are today. So I'm hoping that during our Q&A, you could share a little bit about that as we dig into some of the questions. So I'm going to start off, and Sheriff Lucas, I'm going to go with the guy who looks the most intelligent of the group, and I say that with complete bias because of your wonderful shiny head. I'm going to start with you. So you came to the sheriff's office in your current position about 18 months ago in the wake of a successful campaign that promised change and reform, and you immediately appointed an all-female executive team, which in and of itself was a pretty unprecedented change. I'm just kind of curious, what were some of your goals for coming into office, and what is it about your own background and experience that brought you to becoming a reform-minded sheriff and law enforcement official?
Well, thank you for the question, Eric, and let me thank you and Dave for allowing me to be on the show. And certainly I'm grateful to be on the show with the esteemed guest you have, Judge Mitchell, who's doing some outstanding work in our state capitol, and along with my good friend, Attorney John Birdsall. So I'm truly humbled to be here. Let me start with a little something that my former boss, Commissioner Seelig, might say after having met you two gentlemen for 5 minutes. You know, there's 8 million out of work comedians, and you two guys are trying to be jokers. Just something that he would always say when guys like yourselves are trying to put comedians out of work with your comments.
Sheriff, just keep in mind, we're not getting paid, okay, to do this. All right, anyway.
But thank you for the question, Eric. Let me say my coming to this was very simple. As you indicated, I had been in law enforcement for 25 years, serving in the Milwaukee Police Department. Had a wonderful opportunity that doesn't come to a young boy from the central city of Milwaukee very often, and that was to join professional sports league and Major League Baseball. Did that for 17 years, traveled the country, traveled the world over. And as I was coming in and out of Milwaukee, living in New York at the time, good people like Attorney Birdsall and others were saying, Earnell, it's time for a change in Milwaukee. As we know that there was a long-term sheriff here in Milwaukee County that had sort of lost his way. And so somewhere along the way, that young boy who always tried to do right, who was raised by his grandmother to treat everyone by the golden rule, decided to give up that wonderful opportunity that he had at Major League Baseball and started a campaign. Doing 3 things. One was to change the discourse and the dialogue here in Milwaukee County. We had saw where you couldn't have honest dialogue in the public space without impugning one's integrity or impugning one's humanity. And I thought that was not a proper course for any young person watching or anyone that was here in this community. Second, I felt it was important that we treat everyone with dignity and respect. And that's not just one another. And that was lacking prior to my coming into office, but even how we treat those that come into our care and custody. We ask young sheriff's deputies and correctional officers to be their best when most of the people that they encounter are sometimes at their worst, yet they do it because of the high honor and integrity of this profession. And then lastly, that is what we wanted to do, was to restore the high honor, integrity, and trust of serving in law enforcement, and to deliver the high level of service that the residents of Milwaukee County truly deserve. So our goal from the outset was very basic, very simple. I did a few unorthodox things, as you indicated early on. I looked across the spectrum and hired the best talent available. And in that, I selected the chief deputy who runs the day-to-day operations of the sheriff's office, a former colleague of mine at the Milwaukee Police Department who had gone on and obtained her PhD and was teaching here in the Milwaukee area. And I knew I could trust her to run the day-to-day operations. I knew that she would serve with honor and integrity. And I knew that she would hold everyone in this organization accountable. So that was the first part. Then I looked across what were other sheriff's offices around the country doing. And one of the things that I saw was missing here was having some type of legal counsel or advisor on staff. And so I classified a position in the sheriff's office to make it a chief legal and compliance officer. And very basically, I asked her to do two things. One, to make sure we're doing the right things, and two, make sure we're doing them the right way. Because when we look at agencies around the country, and particularly this agency here, by and large, a number of them are trying to do the right thing, and they are. But then there are a whole lot who are not doing the right things, industry best practices, and that's what leads us into courtrooms and into judgments and awards of taxpayer dollars. So we wanted to avoid that. And then lastly, I felt it was important for us to have more dialogue and engagement with the community. So I found a professional who had been in television, who had been in print media, who had been in radio, and whose late husband was a known figure here in Milwaukee before his passing, and asked her if she would come on board to help us take us to the community. And so those were the three first hires that I made. And since we've come in, gentlemen, I got to admit, in 18 months, we are working to re-engineer this organization, restore it back to the once proud organization it was. And after 18 months, while our work is not through, we got plenty more work to do. I'm very pleased with what we've done thus far.
Well, thanks. And we're going to dig into some of these other form issues. So, but Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you for the next question.
You bet. And this will be a question for you, Judge Mitchell. You know, you've established a reputation for being a passionate advocate for improving the lives of youth and families, and using and reforming the justice system in ways to help to solve problems and not merely as a tool for punishment. Can you give us some understanding of your philosophical and practical approach to justice, and maybe talk a little bit about what you bring to the bench from your own personal background and life experience that's led you to this approach?
All right, thank you so much, man. Yeah, I'm glad to be here with Sheriff Lucas and Attorney Birdsall, as well as you as Dave and Erica. And thank you for this opportunity to kind of sit with these guys who've been really committed to work for a lot longer than I have. But the idea is, you know, when I came to the bench, I adopted this philosophy that it is far easier to build strong children than to prepare broken men and women. And that's from Frederick Douglass. And as a judge, I wanted to be able to make sure that when people come into the courtroom, that the systemic ways in which we deal with families and children, that they're being treated fairly and with kindness and compassion. No sooner than I took the bench, there were a couple of things that I noted that we weren't doing well. And so the system itself was reaped with all kinds of ways in which they saw people, they treated people. And as a judge, you know, you really have the responsibility of these cases to make a determination of how people are being treated. And based on how you respond, then that's how the attorneys then respond, and the people who come into the courtroom act to individuals who are there. So rather than trying to facilitate, you know, in getting in arguments about law, judges have a lot of discretion about a lot of things. And one of the things that I saw initially was the handcuffing of children. And that we were handcuffing children and bringing children to the courtroom without any reason as to why they were there. And it was such a solid practice that nobody wanted to change it. And so I started thinking about, well, it's far easier to build strong children than to prepare broken men. So what can we do as a system to reduce the amount of trauma that these traumatized children and families have already done? And why don't we take some steps to alleviate the burden that they feel when they come into court and anxiety? So we, you know, I led a campaign to remove all handcuffs off our children in Dane County. And you can imagine, I love sheriffs, but our local sheriffs at the time, you could antennas went all off in their head. They were going ballistic, like we can't do this. And they thought chaos was going to reign all over the place. They were putting pamphlets on my door talking about courtroom safety and giving examples of when stuff went crazy. But to your surprise, to many surprise, when we went to that policy a couple of years ago, we've had 0 incidences of young people acting out or being violent as a result of us taking handcuffs off these kids in court. So, my idea is reducing trauma, making sure that the court system is effectively not just passing traumatized children from one system to the next. I don't even want my kids to even have to need Mr. Birdsall's representation. I'm trying to put him out of business. So the best way for me to do that is to make sure that we're not passing children from one traumatized system to the next. I even start using different language. So now I use a language called to describe what I see is the child welfare, the juvenile delinquency to adult prison pipeline. It is that pipeline that is operating, and it's up to me and other judges throughout our state if we really are serious about reducing disparities in the criminal justice system, then we have to pay attention to every case that comes up to us and make micro acts of kindness and decisions so that we're not adding to the trauma that these children experience. And being the only African-American judge in Dane County, you can imagine how, the moment that I started letting Black and brown children and even low-income white children out of custody and allowing their families to give them some support, they used to call me all kind of crazy names like Judge Cut Them Loose. And I had the chief of police here in Madison, attack me several times, talking about I was just releasing kids and I was the reason why they were still in cars. It made me realize that we are dealing with a very complex issue, and that my own story of being a traumatized kid, growing up without a father in Texas, and growing up struggling with trauma and sexual abuse, and that leading to struggles with literacy, and eventually having to work my way up from junior college to Morehouse to Princeton, and then eventually to UW. That I tell the kids that I'm not your judge, I'm your reflection. And if whatever you see in me is the same thing that I believe can happen to you, I'm no exception. I'm the standard of what can happen. And I'm here to tell you that you can do this. So I try to bring that philosophy into every action that I do on the court so that the kid, I know we teasing about bald men right now, but the reason why I even grew my hair out the way to look the way it does is because I wanted to match what the young people were looking like, so that the people who are serving the young people cannot tell them, well, you look wild or you look crazy, because the person who's jurisdictionally responsible for this case and has the most power in this moment looks just like those kids. So I wanted those kids to have that reflection as well. So everything is about intentionality if we are really considerate and trying to be concerned about changing the paradigm. So I try to bring all of that into the tapestry of how I think about the law. And within my discretion, I make sure that I'm coming from a trauma-informed approach rather than a punitive approach.
Wow, that's impressive. Thank you so much. Attorney Birdsall, my understanding is that you work exclusively with clients whom you believe have been wrongly accused, and you apparently have a pretty big passion for your work that transcends the simple 9-to-5 job mentality. What is it about your background, your history, your experience that's motivated you to take on this work with such dedication and tenacity over a pretty long career here?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's really an honor to be on with Earnell Lucas, who I have the highest respect for, and Judge Mitchell, who I'm just meeting today, but sounds like is a very, we have a very like mindset about how human beings in court should be treated. As far as my background goes, this is the way I always describe it to people. I grew up white, privileged, in a rich suburb of Milwaukee, Brookfield, Wisconsin. And I was a little bit of a juvenile delinquent, except I was the Brookfield version of a juvenile delinquent. And if I had been a young Black teen juvenile delinquent living on the north side of Milwaukee in 53206, I probably would have gone to prison doing the same stuff. And so what I developed over the years after I graduated from law school, I went to work for an insurance defense firm. And it was the worst professional experience of my life. And I really just wanted to throw myself out the window because it felt like I just spent 3 years of my life learning this craft. And now I was just defending, companies that were just moving money around the table amongst themselves. So I got into doing criminal work because it's about two things, really, from a lawyer's perspective. One is that it's an intellectual exercise in dealing with constitutional issues. So, Fourth Amendment search and seizure issues, right to counsel, Fifth Amendment Miranda issues, about how we control police conduct by these prohibitions that were put into the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is there for a reason, and it's to control police and government actions that are often excessive. And so it's an enormously intellectual job on that level, but it's also a very humanistic job on another level, because your clients are real human beings and the consequences couldn't be higher. When you handle a civil case as a lawyer, all you're talking about is moving money around. And when you're talking about a criminal case, you're talking about somebody's liberty. And not just their current liberty, which of course is an issue, both pre-trial and after an eventual trial or plea, but you're talking about the consequences for the rest of their life. And I view all of my clients as my immediate first reaction is they're all wrongfully accused, even if they confessed. And I start from there because that's the way the system has been structured and is properly structured, to say that if you want to take away somebody's liberty and put them in a cage for any amount of time, you better be able to prove with real evidence and without any reasonable doubt whatsoever that that person did what you're saying they did. And then the punishment should merit what the offense is. And so it's the passion that I bring to my job every day is really fighting for people that have historically been oppressed. And a lot of our clients over my 30 years have been African Americans, have been people who were too poor and I would take court appointments. They were too poor to get a lawyer, to put on a real defense. And what I discovered was the vast majority of these cases are really kind of paper thin. And that the decisions about where to enforce and how heavily to enforce certain communities has a serious racial tinge to it. And it's fighting against that sort of systemic oppression that really makes my job a worthwhile mission. It's not really just a job, it's a mission that I'm on.
Thank you.
Well, Eric, you mentioned earlier what an impressive panel of guests we have today. And I knew that going into it, but having heard each of you respond to our last few questions here, I'm very impressed with your backgrounds and with your perspectives, which leads me to my question, which is a question for each of you. In your respective professional spheres, you've clearly seen up close how our criminal justice system works, and probably better understand than most what parts of it don't work as well as they probably should. If you had the power and resources to change just one thing, what is the one immediate thing that you would add, subtract, or change about the criminal justice system that would have the biggest impact on improving the lives of the many people that are affected by it? Sheriff, we'll start with you and kind of go through everybody once again.
Can I just add quickly, we will touch on other topics, so just stick with one and then we'll get to some other ones later too.
I'll answer it very quickly. I think money is the one thing that we've got to get out of the criminal justice system. I've argued for years that that while it has its pockmarks and its blemishes, that the American system of jurisprudence is still the finest in the world. And I wouldn't trade it for any of the other forms around the country. But if we're going to change how Black and brown men and women are treated in the criminal justice system, we've got to remove money out of the system so that there's equal opportunity, equal access. All we got to look at is what's been happening with some of the lack of prosecutions and the early releases of individuals in the news, and even the incarceration of those, of some, for similar offenses where others are put away for extended periods, don't have opportunities for bail. And again, it just shows the disparities in this system. So one, we've got to remove money from it, or otherwise it will still be a system of the haves and the have-nots.
And Judge Mitchell?
I would say that there has to be, from a judicial perspective, more willingness to invest in options that allow for judges to be able to make the kind of decisions that make sense. Often, since I don't do a lot of adult criminal, I do mainly juvenile. I'll talk from that perspective. When I'm getting ready to sentence kids, it is helpful to have different alternatives other than just what sending them to Lincoln Hills or Copper Lake. It makes sense that the system itself is really not geared toward, facilitating, healthy, loving kindness of Black and brown, low-income white children. And I started including low-income white children in that paradigm because, when I started seeing low-income white children being treated with disrespect or disregard or being, the idea that we can just throw them away, then I realized that what we do to Black and brown children is even worse. So if we really are committed to this idea of making changes, I just say that as a judge, I need more options. In Dane County, we have no group homes. So that means that any child that I want to be able to put places that don't rise to the level of prison, that means I have to send them out of county. And in many cases, I got kids that I have to send out of state. And I'm talking like Arkansas, as far as Arkansas, sometimes Arizona, Detroit, just to be able to get some kind of care because other places will deny them custody. So, we have to have the options, and the options need to be rooted in some kind of trauma-informed thought processes so that we could assist these children with the pain that they have experienced and ensuring that they get the services. And then secondly, I need more foster home placement. So a lot of my children are raising themselves. I'm sure Sheriff Lucas and Attorney Birdsall know this full well, that a lot of these young people don't have any kind of family unit. And so the family units that they end up adopting are generally those who pull them into negative influences. So having great foster placements that are kind and caring and safe will allow for a lot of these young people to actually have a family system that they can begin to flourish in and put some roots into.
And John, how about you?
So the question is, what would I do with a magic wand? And I think the biggest thing from an attorney's perspective is the elimination of what's called the trial tax, the trial penalty. Because currently, and I'm sure Judge Mitchell sees this in the Dane County Courthouse, but currently, both at the state and federal level, the number of cases, criminal cases, that are resolved by plea is about 97 to 98%. In other words, the right to trial by jury, which is a constitutional right and really the backbone of the system, is virtually eliminated. And it's eliminated by design. And the way that the system was designed was to make the penalties so draconian that your only choice was to enter a plea at the government's mercy so that you wouldn't spend 20, 30, 40 years in prison, and maybe you'd only spend 5. Typically, that is the choice presented to a lot of defendants and a lot of poor defendants. And it's one of the reasons that our prison system has quadrupled in size since the 1980s. We literally have about 23,000 prisoners in the state of Wisconsin right now. The vast majority of them are Black and brown. And the vast majority of those are drug cases. The war on drugs is being fought in predominantly minority and poor communities, and half of all prison admissions come from 3 zip codes on the north side of Milwaukee in the state of Wisconsin. So the system has been very carefully and consciously built to be exploding in size and to focus on certain communities. And I believe if we eliminated, if I could just, again, with the magic wand, restructure the penalties that are currently in the Wisconsin statutes that would allow people to exercise their right to trial, I think that would make a huge dent in that, because people like me and other dedicated criminal defense lawyers would take cases to trial far more often. Because if it was up to me, every case would go to trial, but it's not up to me, it's up to my clients. And they make rational decisions based on the penalties that they're facing and the potential exposure that they have. And so I can only give advice, and I encourage them to go to trial if they can stomach the downside if they lose, because I think that most cases are really very thin most of the time, and it's the penalties that cause people to really subjugate themselves to this governmental power. So that's the main thing I would do. The other thing I would do would be to encourage more transparency with police forces, and probably eliminate the qualified immunity protection that they currently enjoy. And that's, of course, a whole another topic, but that is essentially, in the words of Justice Sotomayor, it encourages a warrior-like shoot first and think later mentality among police forces. And just talking about, we could just talk about Wisconsin, or we could talk about any police forces all over the country, but we see that warrior mentality. And I'm happy to see that Sheriff Lucas is taking some very, very concrete steps to reverse that and have a more humane and humanistic approach to policing.
Well, thank you, Attorney Birdsall. And that's a great segue, because our next question is directed to you, Sheriff Lucas. And, in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the obvious public outcry, the protests, and in some cases violence, and continued use of police force, sometimes excessively in response, has led to really a national discussion about policing, really expedited that discussion in a way that we haven't seen before. And it's even come to a point where there's been some serious discussion about defunding law enforcement. And so, Sheriff Lucas, when you think about these discussions that are happening to defund or disband and remake law enforcement, does this sound rational, or does it set off alarm bells for you, just out of curiosity? And then I'll follow up with another question after that.
No, I think it's a conversation we can have. But let me first also say too that what we witnessed in Minneapolis a month ago, yesterday, in the killing of Mr. George Floyd, was one of the more reprehensible things that I ever witnessed in my 4-decade career in law enforcement. And I think the entire country and the world now has seen that video and said that there's no place for people in this profession who conduct themselves in the manner that those 4 former Minneapolis police officers did. But let me say that, I've been in this business long enough to know we're not perfect people, but what we are proud public servants. And many of us go out each day and place that badge over our heart and leave our homes and leave our families, not knowing whether we're going to return at night. And I'm so humbled to have worked with many who have served and sacrificed in this profession, who have even made the ultimate sacrifice. If we're going to have these discussions and dialogues, I've told all of those local and state and even federal elected officials that, look, it's not a conversation that you can have in a vacuum. That if we're not having a conversation about all the other aspects of the social fabric, that when the education system collapses, that when the healthcare system collapses, that when the mental health system collapses and even the job and economy collapses, it falls down on law enforcement. And despite all of our best efforts, we're all, and many of us are good people raised up in the church, taught the golden rule. Despite all of our best efforts, we're not clinicians, we're not doctors, we're not counselors. And so we're not equipped to handle all of those responsibilities. It's a worthwhile discussion. This sheriff has said from day one, we hear the voices of the people. It's time to begin that dialogue, but let's make sure that we are at the table and not on the menu, and we can have that robust dialogue and discussion about what the future of policing is. Let me just conclude. There's 18,000 police agencies around this country. And it's there for a reason, because citizens all across America have said, we want police and we want them in our community, whether it's in Dane County or Milwaukee County or in Orange County or in any other county in America, to police in the manner in which we ask them to do and want them to do. And so again, when we begin to have this discussion, let's be mindful that there's no one size fit all, and that when we come to the table, let's everybody have a voice in the say of what the future of policing look like. And we can then move forward in honest and authentic and candid dialogue.
Thanks, Sheriff. I have a follow-up, but first, Judge Mitchell, I saw you want to make a comment.
Yeah, when we started, I started my career basically, defending people who were in the Black Lives Matter, and we were doing protests right after Tony Robinson was killed here around 2015. I can tell you from the perspective of men and women who, had wonderful intentions of sitting down with police officers and trying to bring reform. Even at that time, they were so disrespectful to us. I think I had great individuals like Sheriff Mahoney, who's here in Dane County, great friend of mine. We've done great work together, but we started to see resistance from individuals who would basically not give us an opportunity to have a conversation about the kinds of voices that we wanted to have at the table. When you hear these cries for defunding police, abolishing police, or, community control of police, all we have ever been asking for is to get at the table to have a conversation about how we would like to be policed. I mean, Attorney Birdsall already told you about the ways in which certain communities are policed also lead to further arrests and then eventually to further convictions and then to incarceration. All we've ever asked for is a conversation about what that looks like, to be in conversation with those individuals. And just because you have chiefs and sheriffs who are on the same page, we learned very well that doesn't mean that their rank and file follow the chiefs and the sheriff's direction. So just because, Sheriff Lucas can be up there and say, we want to have a conversation, we want to be at the table, they will wait him out and wait for him to retire or to go on to somewhere else so that they can implement somebody else who got a whole different perspective. And so that is what we have been feeling, right? That the tension that we have been feeling over these years. And when you saw 8 minutes, 46 seconds, the idea that he sat on that man's neck and knew he was being recorded and he didn't move, like he didn't even have no sense, like I needed to do this, only reinforces the paradigm that something along that trajectory needs to shift. Now, if this had happened in the South, maybe people would have been like, what, these are just racism. That's a historical legacy of racism. But this is supposed to happen in progressive Minneapolis, Minnesota. Like if that capacity for that to happen there, it is an undercurrent to say that could happen anywhere else. So I can tell that a lot of my white friends and a lot of my white progressives, they get nervous when they hear what these demands. But again, we always stress that we've always just tried to be at the table with our friends, with our law enforcement partners, and say, okay, what does it look like for us to be policed so that we can have a say in that and not be dictated as to what it means for us to be policed.
All right, thank you. And the follow-up really can go to any of you or all of you, but what are one or two concrete reforms that you think would make a positive difference from a community perspective in particular, just as you're describing, Judge Mitchell, if we could see our law enforcement making these reforms? So a couple, Attorney Birdsall, you brought up qualified immunity might be one. We've heard about banning chokeholds. There's a whole movement about the 8 can't wait reforms. So which of the reforms do you think are most pressing? And Sheriff Lucas, I'd be curious to hear which ones do you think are acceptable, and are there some that you're concerned about or that you need a little more conversation about? Whoever wants to go first.
I thought the question went to Attorney Birdsall.
Oh,
Well, no,
I'm-
yeah, it could go to any, all of you.
I'm happy to jump on and expand a little bit about qualified immunity, which is kind of an obscure, I mean, it's real easy to talk about chokeholds because that's a very visible thing that everybody can sort of, understand very, very quickly. It's not so easy to understand kind of an obscurely named concept like qualified immunity. But what it is essentially is an absolute shield against liability for individuals, particularly police, but it's really all government officials, but police in particular, who violate somebody's constitutional rights and usually end up with severe damages. So whether it's somebody dying or getting severely injured or something like that, that person has no ability to hold that officer liable if they were acting within their regular duties as a police officer, because of this concept, which was developed. This was never something that was made by a legislature. It wasn't made by Congress. It wasn't in nothing. It was made by the Supreme Court of the United States in an effort to advance the interests of the police and the government. And it really is something that allowed police to feel as though they're immune to any sort of liability or consequences for their actions. And so when people in poor communities see somebody like this Officer Shevin sit on somebody's neck, they're used to seeing that. That just happened to be caught on camera and happened to be a horrible, horrible incident, but they're used to that in their communities over and over and over. And it's not just deaths. It's not just being murdered in the streets, unarmed, but it's being just like shuttered from society. And so when people talk about defunding the police, you got to understand where that's coming from. It's coming from 250 years of chattel slavery, another 100 years of legalized discrimination, and really only a couple of generations where Black individuals primarily can participate fully in our society since about 1968. And so when we still have this, and that was right around the time, by the way, the qualified immunity came into being, to allow this power structure to have that sort of oppressive force. And so I think I don't think it needs to be eliminated, but I think it needs to be vastly pulled back. And I think that would be an enormous help to show that everybody is accountable for their actions.
If I could follow up,
Yeah.
Eric, there's a number of pieces of legislation that are being proposed. One was on the Senate floor on Wednesday, and that was shot down. One was on the House floor on yesterday that did pass. But the concern that law enforcement have, and I was talking with my counterparts at the major county level on yesterday, including my good friend Sheriff Mahoney there in Dane County. But some of these things have concern for all of us, whether it be the qualified immunity issue that Attorney Birdsall speak of. I don't think law enforcement officers could knowingly come to work knowing that if any action or conduct you take could be cause for some lawsuit or termination or loss of your livelihood and everything. So again, there's room for discussion, but I don't know if any man or woman would want to come into the profession today if that were taken away. Chokeholds is something that I've been in this business, we've never taught. But I will say, in the course of a battle for your life, if individuals have no access to anything on their belt, and it's a battle for your life, you cannot, I heard the word used by the judge earlier, the word discretion, that he or she, it's a battle of whether they go home or the individual goes home. Again, it's one that we got to consider. No knock warrants, something that we've seen have been abhorred in this country for the reasons that Attorney Birdsall mentioned earlier, because tends to criminalize certain segments of the population. Again, we can have discussions about the elimination of them, but do we want, in the cases of terrorists and or cop killers or anyone else, to not have that tool in our toolbox, so to speak? Body cameras, as we've seen, they're not the panacea. They don't solve all of our problems or in this society, and as it relates to law enforcement. So again, we can have that discussion. And then finally, the use of force training. There's two different thoughts or schools out there. There's the use of force continuum, where it starts out with verbal commands to laying on hands to now using one of the non-lethal, less lethal tools at your availability, and then ultimately deadly force as a last resort. But then there's another model out there, and we need to have that discussion, the critical decision thinking model. Is, can I step away from this? Can I back out of this and get the desired result that we want? Meaning, if we look at some of the instances, in particular, the one in Atlanta, was there other alternatives than to pursue the individual through the parking lot? And then, of course, the use of deadly force. I think when we start having those discussions, let's put all these things on the table. And then once we start having that robust conversation and dialogue, I think we can arrive at what, again, our communities want of their police.
And, and I agree with everything both Sheriff Lucas and Attorney Birdsall said. The only thing I probably would add is, we need to have also a legislative fix to Graham versus Connor. I think law enforcement officers are trained on Graham versus Connor as a standard for what kind of force they can use and then what needs to happen. And until we get a place, maybe even return back to Tennessee versus Garner, that standard where, officers at that time had certain limits that you couldn't just, you couldn't just say, well, I was afraid or I felt threatened for my life. And that was a cause for you to be able to get outside of the kind of criminal liability. And, when I started studying these cases, I started recognizing how the training had shifted for law enforcement. I mean, Sheriff Lucas he said he's been in there 4 decades. So he probably knows the shift that happened probably around right after 1989. And policing before 1989 was totally different than policing after 1989. That decision never happened. And so the training shifted as a result of I think the mentality shifted and the ways in which, officers probably could say, like Attorney Birdsall said, he was a, juvenile delinquency in, what's it, Brookfield or kind of, well, they probably did say, hey, John, you've been a damn idiot. Come on, let me take you home, your daddy. Get in this car, boy, and go into your house. Where now they don't have to do that. Now they could just escalate the situation and then say, I was afraid for my life and I had to take John's life. I think if we are really concerned about all the tools being at the table, we have to bring all of the information so that, because the majority of the public, they talk about chokeholds because that's what they see. But the reality is that's not, the chokehold is the end result of a long philosophical training mechanisms that have been implanted into the consciousness of how officers are routinely reinforced and trained. And unless we get back to a fundamental constitutional basis and make sure that the Supreme Court is not supporting this behavior, we're going to continue to see this over and over again. Every time this happens, we say this will never happen again. We're going to make some changes, and then it happens again. So it's just very important at this time, I think, of all the legislative fixes that people will propose about chokeholds and this and that, I just think going back to the Supreme Court, fixing that decision, and then overturning that decision, and then retroactively being able to say, okay, well then now that that's been moved, how do we train law enforcement officers moving forward?
I think if I could, I think part of the problem with policing in general is its origins, which a lot of people don't really understand the evolution of modern policing. And it really began as slave patrols, where white citizens were deputized, and it was to catch and monitor the whereabouts of slaves who were doing their master's bidding. And over the decades, it developed in larger cities into organized, professional police forces. But they were always, at most times, they were used as means of social control. And so while our modern police forces maybe don't have those same exact connotations, the wash of history really has stayed with it, and institutional cultures are really hard to break. And because and that mindset that a lot of police bring to their work of this us against them warrior mentality, which I know specifically Sheriff Lucas does not adopt, but a lot of police forces do, and a lot of police officers do. That is what has to change. And even if they individually are good people and you like them and maybe they're friends with them, when they get into that institutional culture, it carries them. It carries them more than their individual postures. So I don't know the answer to that, other than to keep putting in people with forward-thinking minds and good hearts like Sheriff Lucas, or do like they did in Camden, which was dismantle their police department and start from scratch. In some areas, maybe we need to do that.
Eric and I had an excellent conversation 2 weeks ago with our own police chief here in Wausau, as well as the executive director of the Wisconsin Professional Police Association, talking about this concept and issue of policing in America. And I want to stick with that because, I mean, here we are, we're 2 weeks later, and yet this issue continues to be top of mind for a lot of people. You watch the news every night, and a lot of the stories we see kind of seem very focused on policing and police tactics. Some police tactics have been particularly criticized as contributing to souring relations between police and communities of color. For example, stop and frisk policies and practices seem to be disproportionately affecting African American males. The broken windows policy philosophy has also come under some criticism. What's your take on these policing approaches, and what should law enforcement be doing differently to improve relations with communities of color? And I'll throw that out to whoever would like to answer that. And if you all want to answer it, that's great.
This is a policing question, Dave. I followed all of the models over the course of my time in this profession. And again, it's set by the community standards. And we've evolved over time from MAP versus Ohio and the Terry decision and others. And I think some of the approaches that were used by some of the police agencies around the country got us to where we are right now. That was an overreach, if you will. The broken windows concept was a very, I thought, well-founded, well-thought model for policing and dealing with the smaller attendant problems in a community before they become larger problems. And I think we could all agree, whether it's the judge, if you can deal with a juvenile in his courtroom, they don't have to become housed in an adult courtroom. So I think that there's a number of good virtues to the broken windows concept. And then certainly the stop and frisk had its virtues until it became an overreach to incarcerate more Black and brown people in our society. So again, we need to recorrect that and put safeguards into place for the police and how we conduct and comport ourselves. But by and large, yes, we have to return to the philosophy of the police are the community and the community are the police. I tell the story of a young boy growing up when I was encountered by a police officer. I couldn't have been no more than 12 or 13, and the police officer rolls along, never gets out of his squad car, accusing me of stealing a woman's purse. I said, no, I got a note and $20. And some of you bald heads on this call might know a note and $20 could go a long way back in the early 70s. And the officer said, I'm going to run you over and have this woman identify you. I said, sir, you can do that. But if she doesn't identify me, would you run me back over here to the store and help me get these groceries home? Because grandma's going to be pretty upset. In a moment, that officer sped away. But in that moment, that's what I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Because when you think about the awesome authority that a police officer has, whether a person goes free or whether a person is taken into custody, whether a person lives, and in those unfortunate instances, someone's life is taken, that's something that I wanted to do for this community and for my community. Fast forward, when I joined the police department in 1976, who do I see on my very first day working at the police station? Was that very same officer. And I told him, I said, sir, you do not know this, but you're the reason why I joined this profession. And when you think about now the encounters that young brown and black women have with law enforcement officers and the one that I had, the outcomes are much different, or we wouldn't be having this dialogue here today. And it's because that trust, that bond has been broken. And we've got to work harder, and we've got to work all the time to restore that trust. I'll close with, I call it a bank account, that there are thousands of young men and women that each day go out and make contributions. They make deposits into that bank account, whether it's helping someone in a car crash, whether it's returning a lost child to his family, or any number of acts. But it's that one act that's caught on video, or that becomes the national conversation, that is the ultimate withdrawal, and it makes all of our work challenging and more difficult. So again, we've got to get back into the community, restore that trust that was once there, that this young boy knows all too well from growing up in the central city here, and hope that the young men and women that are coming into this profession today can adapt and adopt the policies and procedures, and more importantly, the culture to serve the people in the manner in which they want the police to serve them. Thank you.
And I'm glad Sheriff Lucas said that. In Dane County, what we have been fighting for is, as I told you, I'm a pastor as well, is that I've been saying to the 26 police units that we have in Dane County, is build relationships when there is no crisis. Don't try to build a relationship with me when there's a national crisis. Build it when there's nothing going on. Build it when there's calm, so that we can trust you. And you know, I invited the majority of our police units to come to our churches on Sunday mornings for no reason other than just to kind of sit and be with us in community together. And since the 4 years since we asked for that invitation, only 2 ever showed up in all of those services. Now people can say, well, community colors are being unreasonable. I'm saying, no, we're not being unreasonable. All we ask them to do is come to church. Sit there. You ain't got to say nothing. You can come in uniform. You can bring your shift. On your shift, just come sit with us. So that when we are trying to build a narrative that it's okay to be police officers, so that my young people can see police officers feel safe and feel good and feel positive about the experience, then that's the moment that I can say that. I can't say it after, we watching 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I can't go out and say that then. But if you had taken advantage of the open door opportunity for us to build those relationships, then I can say, yes, that officer did that. But you remember when Officer Lucas came to the church and he sat down and read books to us doing children's church, and he sat down with the families, and it gives a different narrative. Right now, the reason why there is the intensity is because there's no alternative narrative, because they have not been in communities in ways that we've been begging and asking for. And now, when they get in these crises, then they want to come to us and try to be like, they want us to save a cop. I'm like, I'm not saving a cop now. No, you're going to have to do the hard work just like you require me to do the hard work. And when you're committed to doing that, then we'll sit down and then we'll build a different narrative for us to build on the future.
Thank you, Sheriff Lucas and Judge Mitchell. Attorney Birdsall, do you have any final thoughts? We just have a few seconds here.
Yeah. I want to go back to something Sheriff Lucas brought up earlier, which is, this is, or at least he was intimating, this is a way bigger question than just the police. This isn't just about the police. This is about decisions that are made about how we're going to structure our society, and allowing things like redlining that created the segregated communities that we have, which of course are where a lot of this crime is located, or at least things we call crime, like drug cases. We have to address that in a far more serious way. And I'm hoping that this moment that we're in right now, after George Floyd's murder, because it feels very different to me than other times in the past, I'm hoping that this is the chance for us to make big, bold actions to, cut our prison population in half, to really seriously address transparency of policing. And then I think we can have this, much kinder, gentler vision that both Judge Mitchell and Sheriff Lucas spoke about. And obviously I'm all on board with that, even though I sound like I'm being very combative most of the time.
Well, look, you guys, unfortunately, we're out of time. I feel terrible because we just barely scratched the surface, but I can't thank you enough and think of three more honorable gentlemen to scratch the surface with. So thank you, Sheriff Earnell Lucas. Thank you, Judge Everett Mitchell. Thank you, Attorney John Birdsall. We appreciate your passion, your professionalism, and wish you all the very best as you continue your work on the front lines of improving our criminal justice system here in Wisconsin. And once again, we sincerely apologize to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson for running out of time. Normally, we'd ask him to come back next week, but we just want everyone to know that next week we're taking a break. It's the 4th of July weekend. We're taking a long weekend, so we'll see you in 2 weeks, and we're going to have some exciting stuff coming up. Probably some stuff that's a little. Dave, you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, I think we're gonna take on the topic of the toppling of monuments and whether how much historical revision is too much revision. So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation as well.
All right. Thanks again to our guests. We'll see you in a couple of weeks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.